Hello, everybody. This is Psychology of the Unconscious by Carl Jung, Chapter 3, Part 1, The Hymn of Creation. The second chapter of Miss Miller's work is entitled Gloire du Poème Onirique. 20 years of age, Miss Miller took a long journey through Europe. We leave the description of it to her. After a long and rough journey from New York to Stockholm, and from there to Petersburg and Odessa, I found it a true pleasure to leave the world of inhabited cities and to enter the world of waves, sky, and silence. I stayed hours long on deck to dream, stretched out in a reclining chair. The histories, legends, and myths of the different countries which I saw in the distance came back to me and distinctly blended together in a sort of luminous mist in which things lost their reality, while the dreams and thoughts alone took on somewhat the appearance of reality. At first, I even avoided all company and kept to myself, lost wholly in my dreams, where all that I knew of great, beautiful, and good came back into my consciousness with new strength and new life. I also employed a great part of my time writing to my distant friends, reading and sketching out short poems about the regions visited. Some of these poems were of a very serious character. It may seem superfluous, perhaps, to enter intimately into all these details. If we recall, however, the remark made above, that when people let their unconscious speak, they always tell us the most important things of their intimate selves, that even the smallest detail appears to have meaning. Valuable personalities invariably tell us, through the unconscious, things that are generally valuable, so that patient interest is rewarded. Miss Miller describes here a state of introversion, after the life of the cities with their many impressions had been absorbing her interest, with that already discussed strength of suggestion which powerfully enforced the impression. She breathed freely upon the ocean, and after so many external impressions, became engrossed wholly in the internal, with intentional abstraction from the surroundings, so that things lost their reality and dreams became truth. We know from psychopathology that certain mental disturbances exist which are first manifested by the individual shutting themselves off slowly, more and more, from reality and sinking into their fantasies, during which process, in proportion as the reality loses its hold, the inner world gains in reality the determining power. This process leads to a certain point, which varies with the individual, when the patient suddenly becomes more or less conscious of their separation from reality. The event which then enters its pathological excitation, that is to say, the patients begin to turn towards their environment, with diseased views, to be sure, which, however, still represent the compensating, although unsuccessful attempt at transference. The methods of reaction are naturally very different. I'll not concern myself more closely about this here. This type appears to be generally a psychological rule, which holds good for all neuroses, and therefore also for the normal in a much less degree. We might therefore expect that Miss Miller, after this energetic and persevering introversion, which had even encroached for a time upon the feeling of reality, would succumb anew to the impression of the real world, and also to just as suggestive and energetic an influence as that of her dreams. Let us proceed with the narrative. But the journey drew to an end. The ship's officers outdid themselves in kindness, tout ce qu'il y a de plus empressé et de plus aimable, and I passed many amusing hours teaching them English. On the Sicilian coast, in the harbor of Catania, I wrote a sailor's song, which was very similar to a song well known on the sea, brine, wine, and damsels fine. The Italians, in general, all sing very well, and one of the officers who sang on deck during night watch had made a great impression upon me, and had given me the idea of writing some words adapted to this melody. Soon after that, I was very nearly obliged to reverse the well-known saying, Vedere Napoli e poi morir. That is to say, suddenly I became very ill, although not dangerously so. I recovered to such an extent, however, that I could go on land and visit the sights of the city in a carriage. This day tired me very much, and since we planned to see Pisa the following day, I went on board early in the evening and soon laid down to sleep without thinking of anything more serious than the beauty of the officers and the ugliness of the Italian beggars. One is somewhat disappointed at meeting here, instead of the expected impression of reality, rather a small intermezzo, a flirtation. Nevertheless, one of the officers, the singer, had made a great impression. Il m'avait fait beaucoup d'impression. The remark at the close of the description, sans songer à rien de plus sérieux, que la beauté des officiers, and so diminishes the seriousness of the impression, it is true. The assumption, however, that the impression openly influenced the mood very much is supported by the fact that a poem upon a subject of such an erotic character came forth immediately. Brine, wine, and damsels fine, and in the singer's honor. One is only too easily inclined to take such an impression lightly, and one admits so gladly the statements of the participators that when they represent everything as simple and not at all serious. I dwell upon the impression at length because it's important to know that an erotic impression, after such an introversion, has a deep effect and is undervalued, possibly by Miss Miller. The suddenly passing sickness is obscure and needs a psychologic interpretation, which cannot be touched upon here because of lack of data. The phenomenon now to be described can only be explained as arising from a disturbance which reaches to the very depths of her being. From Naples to Livorno the ship traveled for a night, during which I slept more or less well. My sleep, however, is seldom deep or dreamless. It seemed to me as if my mother's voice wakened me just at the end of the following dream. At first I had a vague conception of the words, when the morning stars sang together, which were a preludium of a certain confused representation of creation and of the mighty chorals resounding through the universe. In spite of the strange, contradictory, and confused character which is peculiar to the dream, there was mingled in it the chorus of an oratorio which had been given by one of the foremost musical societies of New York, and with that were also memories of Milton's Paradise Lost. Then from out of this whirl there slowly emerged certain words which arranged themselves in 3 strophes, and indeed they seemed to be in my own handwriting, in ordinary blue-lined writing paper, on a page of my old poetry book which I always carried around with me. In short, they appeared to me exactly as some minutes later they were in reality in my book. Miss Miller now wrote down the following poem, which she rearranged somewhat a few months later, to make it more nearly, in her opinion, like the dream original. When the Eternal first made sound, a myriad ears sprang out to hear, and throughout all the universe there rolled an echo deep and clear, all glory to the God of sound. When the Eternal first made light, a myriad eyes sprang out to look, and hearing ears and seeing eyes once more a mighty choral took, all glory to the God of light. When the Eternal first gave love, a myriad hearts sprang into life, ears filled with music, eyes with light, pealed forth with hearts with love all rife, all glory to the God of love. Before we enter upon Miss Miller's attempts to bring to light through her suppositions the root of this subliminal creation, we will attempt a short analytic survey of the material already in our possession, the impression of the ship which had already been properly emphasized, so that we need have no further difficulty in gaining possession of the dynamic process which brought about this poetical revelation. It was made clear in the preceding paragraphs that Miss Miller possibly had not inconsiderably undervalued the importance of the erotic impression. This assumption gains in probability through experience, which shows that, very generally, relatively weak erotic impressions are greatly undervalued. One can see this best in cases where those concerned, either from social or moral grounds, consider an erotic relation as something quite impossible. For example, parents and children, brothers and sisters, relations between older and younger men, and so on. If the impression is relatively slight, then it does not exist at all for the participators. If the impression is strong, then a tragic dependence arises, which may result in some great nonsense or be carried to any extent. This lack of understanding can go unbelievably far. Mothers who see the first directions in their small son in their own bed, a sister who half playfully embraces her brother, a 20-year-old daughter who still seats herself on her father's lap, and then has strange sensations in her abdomen. These are all morally indignant to the highest degree if one speaks of sexuality. Finally, our whole education is carried on with a tacit agreement to know a little as possible of the erotic and to spend abroad the deepest ignorance in regard to it. It's no wonder, therefore, that the judgment in puncto of the importance of an erotic impression is generally unsafe and inadequate. Miss Miller was under the influence of a deep erotic impression, as we have seen. Because of the sum total of the feelings aroused by this, it doesn't seem that this impression was more than dimly realized, for the dream had to contain a powerful repetition. From analytical experience, one knows that the early dreams which patients bring for analysis are nonetheless of a special interest because of the fact that they bring out criticisms and valuations of the physician's personality, which previously would have been asked for directly in vain. They enrich the conscious impressions which the patient had of his physician, and often concerning very important points. They're naturally erotic observations which the unconscious was forced to make, just because of the quite universal undervaluation and uncertain judgment of the relatively weak erotic impression. In the drastic and hyperbolic manner of expression of the dream, the impression often appears in almost unintelligible form on account of the immeasurable dimension of the symbol. A further peculiarity which seems to rest upon the historic strata of the unconscious is this, that an erotic impression, to which conscious acknowledgment is denied, usurps an earlier and discarded transference that expresses itself in that. Therefore, it frequently happens, for example, that among young girls at the time of their first love, remarkable difficulties develop in the capacity for erotic expression, which may be reduced analytically to disturbances through a regressive attempt at resuscitation of the father image, or the father imago. Indeed, one might presume something similar in Miss Miller's case, for the idea of the masculine creative deity is a derivation, analytically and historically psychologic, from the father imago, and aims, above all, to replace the discarded infantile father transference in such a way that for the individual the passing from the narrow circle of the family into the wider circle of humanity may be simpler or made easier. In light of this reflection, we can see in the poem and its preludium the religious, poetically formed product of an introversion depending upon the surrogate of the father imago. In spite of the incomplete apperception of the effectual impression, essential component parts of this are included in the idea of compensation as marks, so to speak, of its origin. Pfister has coined it as a striking expression, law of the return of the complex. The effectual impression was that of the officers singing in the night watch. When the morning stars sang together, the idea of this opened a new world to the girl, creation. This creator has created tone, then light, and then love. That is the first to be created, should have been tone, can be made clear only individually, for there's no cosmogony except the gnosis of Hermes, and generally quite unknown system, which have such tendencies. But now we might venture a conjecture, which is already apparent, and which soon will be proven thoroughly, viz. The following chain of associations. The singer, the singing morning stars, the god of tone, the creator, the god of light, of the sun, of the fire, and of love. The links of the chain are proven by the material, with the exception of fire and sun, which I put in parentheses, but which, however, will be proven through what follows in the further course of analysis. All these expressions, with one exception, belong to erotic speech. My God, star, light, my sun, fire of love, fiery love, etc. Creator appears indistinct at first, but becomes understandable through the reference to the undertones of Eros, to the vibrating chord of nature, which attempts to renew itself in every pair of lovers and awaits the wonder of creation. Miss Miller had taken pains to disclose the unconscious creation of her mind to her understanding, and indeed through a procedure which agrees in principle with psychoanalysis, and therefore leads to the same results as psychoanalysis. But as usual happens with laymen and beginners, Miss Miller, because she had no knowledge of psychoanalysis, left off at the thoughts which necessarily bring the deep complex lying at the bottom of it to light in an indirect, that is to say, censored manner. More than this, a simple method, merely the carrying out of the thought to its conclusion, is sufficient to discover the meaning. Miss Miller finds it astonishing that her unconscious fantasy does not, following the Mosaic account of her creation, put light in the first place, instead of tone. Now follows an explanation, theoretically constructed and correct ad hoc, the hollowness of which is, however, characteristic of all similar attempts at explanation. She says, it is perhaps interesting to recall that Anaxagoras also had the cosmos arise out of chaos through a sort of whirlwind, which doesn't happen usually without producing sound. But at this time I had studied no philosophy, and knew nothing either of Anaxagoras or his theories about some Greek word, which I, unconsciously, was openly following. At that time also I was equally in complete ignorance of Leibniz, and therefore knew nothing of his doctrine, dum deus calculat fit mundus. Miss Miller's reference to Anaxagoras and to Leibniz both refer to creation by means of thought. That is to say, that divine thought alone could bring forth a new material world, a reference at first not intelligible, but which will soon, however, be more easily understood. We now come to those fancies which Miss Miller principally drew her unconscious creation. In the first place, there is the Paradise Lost by Milton, which we had at home in the edition illustrated by Doré, and which would be delighted me from childhood. Then the Book of Job, which had been read aloud to me since the time of my earliest recollection. Moreover, if one compares the first words of Paradise Lost with my first verse, one notices that there is the very same verse, of man's first disobedience, when the Eternal first made sound. My poem also recalls various passages of Job, and in one or two places in Handel's oratorio, the creation which came out very indistinctly in the first part of the dream. The lost paradise, which, as is well known, is so closely connected with the beginning of the world, is more clearly evident by the verse of man's first disobedience, which is concerned evidently with the fall, the meaning of which need not be shown any further. I know the objection which everyone unacquainted with psychoanalysis will raise, viz. That Miss Miller might just as well have chosen any other verse as an example, and that accidentally she had taken the first one that happened to appear, which had its content, also accidentally. As is well known, the criticism which we hear equally from our medical colleagues and from our patients is generally based on such arguments. This misunderstanding arises from the fact that the law of causation in the psychical sphere is not taken seriously enough. It is to say, there are no accidents, no just as wells. It is so, and there is, therefore, a sufficient reason at hand why it is so. It's moreover true that Miss Miller's poem is connected with the fall, wherein just that erotic component comes forth, the existence of which we've surmised above.